Hey, it's Anne-Marie with Speak Confident English, and this week I have something really special for you. One of the most common questions that I get is, how can I improve my vocabulary? Or, why do I always forget words when I'm trying to speak? So to help answer that question, this week I've interviewed Ben of IELTSpodcast.com. And in this interview, he and I talk about smart strategies that you can use to boost your vocabulary. And we focus on two areas. Number one, how can you improve your vocabulary if you're preparing for an exam like IELTS or TOEFL? On those exams, you have to do writing and speaking, and you definitely need strong vocabulary to do that. We also talk about effective strategies for adding active vocabulary to your everyday conversations so that it's easier if you're going to chat with your neighbor, if you want to be able to have small talk with colleagues, or just start conversations more easily. So keep watching so that you can get all of those effective strategies, and I've got lots of links for you in the online lesson and below this video. So today I'm chatting with Ben, who is the founder of IELTSpodcast.com. And Ben, instead of me telling everybody what that is all about, would you share a little bit about who you are and what is IELTSpodcast.com?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for having me today, Anna-Marie. IELTSpodcast.com is an online resource with lots of tutorials and audio tutorials and online courses to help students pass IELTS. And we're quite confident with what we do, so there's a guarantee in there for the written course. We've jumped to a band 7 or it's free. And so if any of your listeners are struggling with IELTS, then you're more than welcome to go over there, get some resources, get some IELTS materials, and even send us an email. We'd love to hear from them.
Great, that's awesome. Well, today you and I are going to chat specifically about vocabulary and how to improve your vocabulary for an exam like IELTS or TOEFL, but also just in general for conversation. But before we do that, I actually want to ask, how did you get into focusing on IELTS and why did you start the podcast?
Right. Well, I got into IELTS because I'm kind of results driven, and if I was teaching English, I could see some improvement, but I like measuring it and I like improving. So the standardized exam is kind of like a good fit for what I like to do, because we can see the improvement and we can see the results. So that's why I kind of orientated more to the exam preparation. Right. Because I want to see what works, what doesn't work. And if you're teaching a bunch of students business English, for example, it's much harder to measure. Yes. So I got into IELTS for that reason. And then what was the second question?
What did I ask? Why did you decide to start the podcast?
Super, yeah. Okay. Right. The reason I started the podcast was because I knew that there would be lots of knowledge trapped in teachers' heads. And a good way to access that and to distribute it would be the podcast. And plus, I'm a real big fan of students learning a language naturally. And when we learn another language naturally, we develop our hearing first. So podcast was sort of like a really good medium to use to distribute this knowledge. And then as I got deeper into the subject of IELTS as well, I started doing my own podcasts, and now it's a mixture of sort of like quality professionals and tutorials, interviews with students. It's quite broad. It's very much broader than it was when it started.
Yeah, I love that. Well, to get a little bit more focused on the vocabulary side, so something that's definitely true for any exam such as IELTS or TOEFL is you have to have a really strong vocabulary to pass those exams. And I'm curious, how do you help students boost their vocabulary while they're preparing for those?
Well, there's quite a few different methods, and I'll just preface this before we jump in. What's really important is that the student finds out what works for them personally.
Right.
maybe maybe they memorize words very easily just by seeing them. Other students might have to hear them. So you really need to find out what makes you tick, what makes you remember the words, what works for you personally, and then use that strategy. But I'll give you just a brief overview of what I've seen work for a lot of students over time. And what I find is that a lot of students will try just to memorize lists, and this is only part of the problem. Because when you memorize lists, you've got it all there, but it's like in your passive vocabulary. And that might be okay for writing. I mean, it's not perfect, but in writing, we've got time to experiment. When we're constructing a sentence, we can go back. We've got this luxury. But with speaking, it's not the same. With speaking, we've got to move it into the active vocabulary, because we're going to be speaking as a spontaneous activity. So what I recommend for students is that they memorize the list, but also they push it to the next level and start actively trying to use those new words in the spoken dialogues. So that would be the case for the speaking, and then with the writing as well, similar. Try and use it in the essays. Try and use it maybe like 3 or 4 times in some practice sentences. And just one last thing to mention is that a good way to memorize lists, and I'm doing this with Polish, which is a language I'm learning at the moment, is with flashcards. We've seen from personal experience, I know that flashcards work for me because I can see it, and if I can hear the word, this is fantastic. We've also got like flashcards in the online course as well to help students get the vocabulary that they need. But yeah, from a personal point of view, flashcards work fantastically for me.
Yeah. So before I go on to my next question, I want to comment on a few things that you said that I really liked. Number one, you said students have to find out what works for them. And I really love that you say that, because I often talk about the students who are part of the Confident English community. Many of them struggle with thinking some people are good at languages and they can learn to speak, and that's great, but I can't. I'm shy, I'm nervous, I must not be good at learning languages. And I'm constantly saying, that's not the case. You just haven't found the method or technique that has worked for you. And the classrooms that you've been in maybe haven't introduced you to the strategies that will actually help you. So I love that you said students really need to find what works for them.
And absolutely, yeah, I totally agree. And there's another point there that is that we can, I do this all the time, but I constantly beat myself up because I'm comparing myself with other people, maybe in different areas. And we've got to be sort of like forgiving with ourselves. It sounds like maybe a little bit woo-woo, you know?
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true.
And we've got to like, know, okay, I haven't performed in this area because maybe this strategy wasn't for me. I mean, you've got to be honest as well. Maybe you were slacking, but also you've got to be open to the idea that, okay, this technique wasn't for me. Let's try another technique.
Right.
And the idea, I think, is just to keep going and keep moving, because you only fail when you give up.
Totally. I agree. The other thing I like that you talked about was the passive versus active vocabulary. And that's something, again, that we talk a lot about in my Fluency School course. And I always tell students, passive vocabulary, it's like the words are back here in your mind and you have to work really hard to get back there and find them. They're somewhere. But what we want to do is bring them to the front so you can just use them in the moment that you need to write or speak. And that really is a process of activating what you've heard, what you've learned, those kinds of things. And I like your focus on the repetition and flashcards, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, it's bringing it from the back to the front. I like that analogy. It's easy. It's just effective. And it just reminds me, when I was teaching in Spain, I taught at this academy that was really big on flashcards. And their whole goal was getting students to pass the exam. So the students weren't getting challenged with the speaking or, conversations. They just had to pass this writing exam. It was really, really silly, if you ask me. But anyway, the whole academy was geared towards using flashcards and getting the students through this exam. But the exam, as I said, was just focused on the writing. And so the students we were just using flashcards all the time, and it was really effective. It was extremely powerful for
Wow.
learning the lists of words. But the students, when we tried to engage them in a conversation, it was so heartbreaking because they just couldn't get these words from the back of their mind to the front, because there was just no like train tracks there. There's no path there at all. And yeah, it was really sad because it was only half of the situation and half of the equation.
Right. And I think sometimes that sets you up. You think if you've got something memorized, you think suddenly you know all these words, and that's great. You're advancing your level, you're advancing your vocabulary. But the truth is, if you can't actively use it in that spontaneous speech or written communication, then something's missing. And so there are some extra steps to take to activate it.
Exactly. And this is so true. And spontaneity is a very important factor for the speaking, because I remember when I was learning Spanish and the conversation would be bouncing around and I'm trying to follow it. And then I finally get the words that I need to construct my sentence, and I'm about to speak and the topic's changed.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, gotta get faster, gotta get better, you know?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
it's because I was pulling it, I was looking for it all in the back of my mind, and I had to pull it all out of there, dust it off, construct it, and boom.
Yeah, and then it's too late.
Exactly.
Definitely, I have that experience in French too, for sure. Well, I'm curious. So I don't know if you would say if there's a different strategy, but I think sometimes there's a little bit of difference between students who are preparing for an exam when they need really sort of academic, high-level vocabulary versus students who just want to talk to their neighbors. They want to talk to people at the grocery store. They just need basic phrases and collocations that native speakers use every day to have conversations without stress and fear. And I'm curious, for those students who aren't preparing for an exam, they just want to get more vocabulary for their daily conversation, do you have any other techniques or strategies you'd recommend?
Right. Okay, this is a really good question. So we're talking about on a like general situation, less so for exam cramming or exam preparation, on a general basis. I mean, there's a few different strategies. I mean, and a few different websites like Quizlet. Quizlet.com is pretty good for flashcards. Also, the course that I'm doing at the moment, I'm just only using the flashcards, which goes back to what we said before about finding what works for you. On the course that I've got, I think it's 17-minute languages. There's lots of different ways to learn on that site. There's dialogues, there's gap fill, there's all these things. But I'm just focusing on the flashcards because I know that's effective for me. Now, what I will be doing is trying to spot those words sort of like in the city, in Warsaw, where I am now, and try and spot them just to sort of like make sure they're not, once they're learned, that they're not stuck there in the back of my mind. You know, I'm trying to pull them out regularly. And I think the key will be largely going back to what we said before, is just making sure that it's in my active vocabulary. And one way I did this, I'm not quite at the level to do this with my Polish yet. I will be soon. But with my Spanish, one thing that I did was I realized that I had one friend, his name's Joaquin, and he was a little bit more cultured, a little bit more sophisticated than my other friends, and his vocabulary was much richer because he always tripped me up when he was speaking. So what I did was I would steal his words and write them down, and then try and sometimes, I mean, you have to be tactful when you're doing this, but I would try and steer the conversation towards an opportunity of using these words, or put myself in an environment where I would be using my new sophisticated, cultured vocabulary, stolen or pilfered from Joaquin, you know? So it was just a case of not only actively trying to be aware that it's in the passive, I've got to push it to the active and be actively aware of that fact, but actively doing it, you know, and just steering the conversations towards that as well.
But I love that you mentioned some specific resources, and I'll definitely include links to those below the video in the YouTube notes and also in the online lesson. So my last question is, what is one thing? So for a student that's watching this, and whether they're preparing for an exam or they just want to add new vocabulary to their daily conversation, what is one thing you would recommend that they started doing today?
I'm going to go a little bit higher level than tactics. You know, like a tactic might be, I don't know, write out 20 words every day and translate them from native English, from your native language to your target language. I think something that could be more valuable and has definitely been more powerful for me has been getting the habit, getting the routine, and getting the ritual. Because I find once you've got that in place, it's much easier to progress and to move forward. In my case, it was like doing 17 minutes of the flashcards on a daily basis. I have tripped up actually, about 3 days ago I stopped, but I should admit it. But before that, I had a run of like 20 days and I was just boom, boom, you know?
Yeah.
And that was much more powerful, what I found, than sort of like putting all this pressure. It was like, okay, I'm going to just break it down into small tasks, and the repetition and the consistency and the routine I found been much more powerful, because we both know that learning a language, you got to be in it for the long haul. And I think the long haul works best with routines and consistency.
Right.
So that would be my tip.
Yeah, I love that, because I think so often, I know for myself, even with French, but I think often for those of us learning languages, we suddenly get this spike of motivation. We say, I'm going to study for 3 hours tomorrow. And we do that for 3 hours, and then we don't do anything for 2 weeks. And everything we did for those 3 hours is totally wasted. And instead, if we just did like 5 little minutes, but did it every day, it's so much more powerful, and we don't lose anything.
Exactly. You're not beating yourself up if you fail, you know, and you don't feel bad if you just do 3 days solid and then leave it for a month, you probably feel terrible and you're not going to learn anything. But if you keep to those just small commitments, it's easier to stick to. You feel better, you get momentum, and then you can start really, once you get momentum, I find anything's easier to do, because you're getting encouraged, you're getting encouragement, you're seeing results, and it's much easier to maintain. So yeah, totally agree with you there.
I love that. And Ben, before we finish, is there anything else you want to add, or anything you maybe thought about and forgot to say that you want to?
Just 2 things. One, another point that we didn't really mention because we were focusing on vocab, but getting feedback is a very, very important factor. And you could get feedback maybe from your own tutor, or you can find an online essay correction service at IELTS Podcast. We've got essay corrections, an essay correction service there. So yeah, getting feedback is also a critical point, because you're going to see where you're going wrong, where you're going right, and it kind of builds on that momentum, the idea of getting momentum, because you're going to be improving much, much faster. And yeah, so if any student is struggling with their IELTS, they can go to IELTSpodcast.com, they can get some free materials, get feedback on their essay, and if they're in a real rush, they can join the online course. And yeah, we'll just be more than happy to receive any students there, and would love to get them results and get them through this horrendous experience, as some students have called it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ben. It was such a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, it was a good time. Thank you very much for having me.